Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something that's just everywhere in modern life, sugar.
Yeah, it's unavoidable almost.
Exactly. And we've got a great stack of material here, mostly focusing on the book The Case Against Sugar by Gary Taubes.
Taubes. You might know him from Why We Get Fat.
Mhm.
He definitely likes to challenge the standard thinking on diet.
He does. So our mission today is to really unpack the arguments he's making in this book. We're looking at the history, the science behind it all, and maybe surprisingly, the influences that shaped how we even think about sugar.
It's quite a story, actually.
Yeah.
Lots of twists and turns.
So get ready. Because, some of the things we'll cover might just change how you see that teaspoon in your coffee or like your favorite soda, even that yogurt you thought was healthy.
It's definitely information that affects pretty much everyone.
Okay, let's dive right in. The book kicks off with something pretty stark. The huge rise in diabetes. It takes us back to 1921. There was this prominent physician, Elliot Joslin. And he was already calling what he saw an epidemic. He even mentioned finding 7 people with diabetes in just 3 houses in his own hometown.
7 people, 3 houses, back then. Now compare that to, say, 2012 figures from the book.
Right.
In the U.S., it was something like 1 in 7 or 8 adults with diabetes. That's 12-14%?
Huge numbers.
And another 30% predicted to get it. Think about that pace. Nearly 2 million Americans diagnosed in that 1 year alone.
That works out to a new case every, 15 or 16 seconds?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Just constantly. And it wasn't just, the general population. Among U.S. military veterans, 1 in 4 patients admitted to VA hospitals had diabetes.
1 in 4. That scale is it's mind-boggling. And this isn't just a U.S. problem, is it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The source makes that really clear. You see these same kinds of explosive diabetes epidemics popping up all over the globe.
Like what?
Well, in Native American tribes like the Pima, half the adults there now have it. First Nations people in Canada, populations right across the Pacific Islands, Polynesians, Micronesians, Melanesians, Aboriginal populations in Australia, the Maoris in New Zealand, and then across the Middle East, Asia, Africa too.
So it's following a pattern then?
That's the crucial thing the book emphasizes.
Yes.
A very consistent pattern. These epidemics show up whenever and wherever populations start eating Western-style diets and living, Western lifestyles.
So it's tied to acculturation, urbanization.
Exactly. Those shifts seem to be the trigger.
So Taubes' point here, I guess, is that this is happening so dramatically, so quickly in so many different groups. As soon as they adopt this way of life,
Right.
It just screams that something big must have changed.
Right. Something fundamental in the diet or environment.
And he makes this argument, doesn't he, that if this were some kind of infectious disease spreading like this.
Oh, absolutely. There'd be global panic, huge investigations, task forces, everything torn apart looking for the cause.
But because we label it a lifestyle disease, well, maybe that urgency, that kind of deep questioning, hasn't really happened in the same way.
Yeah, it suggests maybe a blind spot in how we've tackled this huge health crisis.
Definitely something to think about. Okay, so if that's the big picture problem, let's rewind and look at sugar itself. Its history is pretty wild.
It really is.
The source traces it coming into Europe, and initially, it wasn't just food. It was heavily used as medicine.
And a spice.
Yeah, medicine, spice, decoration, preservative. It had many roles. You see it way back. Henry II used it as a spice, late 12th century.
Wow.
Edward I household, 1288, apparently used over 6,200 pounds. That's a massive amount for the time.
6,200 pounds.
And even someone like Thomas Aquinas apparently said it was okay during fasts because it was seen as helping digestion, medicinal.
So like a health supplement almost.
Kind of, yeah. For 500 years, it was taken as much for health reasons, invigorating the weak, refreshing the weary, as for just taste. That perception is so different from today. And then, of course, Columbus. He brought sugarcane to the New World, right? 293.
Second voyage, yeah. And it grew incredibly well there. But its cultivation became just tragically tied up with the slave trade.
Yeah, the book is pretty stark on that.
Horrifically so. By the 1830s, when the British ended slavery, something like 12.5 million Africans have been shipped over. And the book states that 2/3 of them, they worked and died growing and refining sugar.
2/3. It's just deeply woven into that horrific history.
Absolutely.
Then the 19th and 20th centuries come along, and it shifts again from being rare and expensive to, well, a mass market thing.
Oliver Chase's Candy Machine, 1847. That really kicks off the modern candy industry. Suddenly, sweets weren't just for the rich. They could be made cheaply for everyone, especially kids.
And then just a flood of innovations putting sugar into everything.
Relentless innovation, yeah. The ice cream soda fountain, the 1870s. The sundae, 1892. The ice cream cone, 1904.
Eskimo pie, good shake bars, popsicles.
Eskimo pie, 1919. Good humor, 1920. Popsicles, 1923. Each one was like a new way to deliver sugar, making it more accessible, more desirable.
And soft drinks. They just exploded, didn't they?
Completely. Coca-Cola went nationwide by the late 1890s, spending enormous amounts on advertising even back then.
And Pepsi followed.
Right behind them, yeah, mirroring that same kind of exponential growth. So by the early 20th century, Americans were already consuming over 100 pounds of sugar per person per year.
100 pounds. Plus billions of bottles of soda.
It just shows how fast it became embedded once it was cheap and everywhere. And there's that weird story in the book about sugary cereals.
Oh, yeah, the breakfast cereals. They started as health food.
That was the initial marketing push, yeah.
Yeah.
Health food. But sales weren't great.
And then this guy, Jim Rex, an industry outsider, he sees his kids dumping sugar on their cereal.
And have that aha moment, right? Why not just sell it already sugared?
Brilliant, in a way.
From a marketing perspective, absolutely. Yeah. And that idea just took off. Over the next 20 years, the cereal companies created dozens of these sugar-coated cereals.
Sometimes half the calories were sugar.
Sometimes, yeah. And they used massive ad budgets, cartoon characters, targeting kids directly. They even openly called the products candy-like.
A far cry from health food.
A very far cry.
It really shows how sugar got tied up with convenience and marketing, especially to kids. Now, the book raises this other really powerful idea, maybe controversial, thinking about sugar as a drug.
Yeah, Taubes uses this thought experiment. Imagine a drug, right? No immediate, obvious bad effects like, staggering around or slurring your words.
Okay.
But definite long-term consequences years later. In the short term, though, it makes kids happy, it calms them down, eases little pains, helps them focus even.
Until it wears off.
Until it wears off, yeah. Then they're maybe irritable, wanting more.
And the question he poses is, how long does it take before parents start using that? To soothe, to prevent a tantrum, just to distract?
How long before it becomes just normal?
Right.
For celebrations, showing love, part of every holiday, every gathering.
How long until even people really struggling financially prioritize this thing over more nutritious food?
And that quote from the anthropologist Sidney Mintz, he called it near invulnerability to moral attack.
That's powerful.
Mintz apparently found that sugar as a drug idea pretty fitting, especially for refined sucrose. And he argued that it was precisely because the negative effects were so delayed, so much less visible than, say, alcohol.
Right.
That sugar kind of slipped under the radar for centuries. It avoided the religious condemnation, the health warnings that other substances got.
The price is paid, but much, much later.
But decades later, often. And this idea wasn't totally new even back then. By the early 20th century, people were already talking about a sugar appetite that grows by gratification, kind of hinting at craving or dependence.
And fast forward to now, sugar or some kind of sweetener is in almost everything processed.
Virtually unavoidable, often hidden under, 50-plus different names on labels?
Yeah. And the book points out that whole trend of removing fat from products.
The low-fat craze, yeah.
They often just swap the fat out for sugar, right? Things like low-fat candy bars, yogurts, to keep them tasting good.
And sometimes they even marketed those sugary versions as the healthier choice because they were low-fat.
Right. And the argument Taubes makes is that sugar's ubiquity isn't just because it tastes good, the pause that refreshes.
No, he suggests it's more than that.
Yeah.
That first real taste of intense sweetness can be like, well, his words are an astonishment, a kind of intoxication.
Intoxication.
Yeah, sparking a craving that can last a lifetime. Similar maybe to other drugs of abuse, but again, without those immediate, obvious downsides.
Okay, let's shift into the science, how we understand sugar and health. The source argues we might have taken a pretty long detour here, like 90 years long.
Yeah, that's the framing. Modern nutrition science, kicking off in the 1860s, was really built around energy balance. Calories in, calories out.
Using things like calorimeters.
Exactly. And that became the foundation, defining diets by calories protein, vitamins, minerals. And it was great for figuring out deficiency diseases like scurvy or pellagra.
Sure.
But when they applied that same lens to obesity, the conclusion was pretty straightforward. You gain weight because you eat more energy than you burn. Simple as that.
And certain physicians really push this idea.
Oh, yeah. People like Carl von Norden, Louis Newberg, they became very influential proponents of this calorie model. And they often framed obesity as basically just overeating or lessened outflow of energy.
Sometimes even getting a bit moralistic about it.
Yeah, using phrases like perverted appetite or blaming it on human weaknesses like overindulgence and ignorance, basically faulting the individual's willpower.
But there was another perspective bubbling up, wasn't there? Especially in Europe.
There was. Some researchers argued obesity wasn't just about willpower or calories, it was more of a biological dysregulation.
Dysregulation? How so?
They saw fat cells as behaving differently, actively hoarding calories, almost selfishly, leaving other body tissues short of energy, regardless of how much someone ate or exercised.
Wow. One physician, Bauer, used a really strong analogy.
He did. He compared fat tissue to a malignant tumor or even a fetus, something living for itself. Really highlights that idea of it being outside normal control.
That's a stark image. And this is where hormones start to become really important, right? Insulin, specifically.
Absolutely critical. Mid-20th century research, people like Yalow and Burson doing Nobel Prize-winning work, they figured out how hormones control fat. Most hormones actually help release fat from storage to be used as fuel. But insulin, it does the opposite.
It tells fat cells to store fat.
Exactly. Its main job regarding fat is signaling fat cells to take up fatty acids and glucose from the blood and hold on to them as fat. Only when insulin levels fall low enough do the fat cells let go of that stored energy.
So they called insulin lipogenic.
The most lipogenic hormone, meaning fat-forming.
Okay, so this insight starts to suggest that maybe diets low in carbohydrates.
Right, because carbs are the main thing that spikes your blood sugar, which then spikes your insulin.
Those diets might actually work differently for weight loss because they keep insulin lower.
That was the implication. And it led to some of those low-carb, high-fat diets becoming quite fashionable, especially in the 1960s.
But these were often pushed by doctors outside the mainstream.
Yeah, often physicians not in the big academic nutrition departments. And the established figures, people like Fred Stair at Harvard, Jean Mayer, they really pushed back hard.
They stuck to the calorie model.
They doubled down on calories in, calories out, dismissed low-carb diets as dangerous fads, quackery basically. The dominant message, repeated everywhere, was essentially, you can't lose weight unless you cut calories, period.
And the book argues the sugar industry saw an opportunity here.
A huge one.
Yeah.
As long as the scientific consensus, the nutrition establishment, framed obesity only as an energy balance problem, just eating too much.
Then the idea that a calorie is a calorie holds up.
Exactly. And if a calorie is just a calorie, then a calorie of sugar is no more fattening than a calorie of anything else. The book calls this assumption a gift given to the sugar industry by nutritionists.
So did the industry actively use that?
Oh, absolutely. In 1956, they launched a big campaign, like $750,000, specifically to fight back against any suggestion that sugar was fattening.
Using the calorie argument.
Explicitly. Their ads said sugar was neither a reducing food nor a fattening food. All based on that idea that calories burned as energy can't be stored as fat.
And they'd already set up organizations to handle this kind of thing.
They had. The Sugar Institute back in 1928, and then the Sugar Research Foundation, the SRF, in 1943, funded by the industry, of course.
And their goal was?
Pretty clear. Secure all known facts about sugar, their version of the facts anyway, and defend sugar as a food. They even looked at successful marketing, like the Sun-Kissed Orange campaigns, as a model.
Sounds very organized. What about during World War II rationing? Didn't that raise questions about whether we need sugar?
It did, interestingly. Some nutrition experts and government pamphlets actually suggested sugar wasn't essential at all for health. One pamphlet apparently said flat out, "How much sugar do you need?" None.
Wow. How did the industry react to that?
They weren't happy. They called it sugarcoating the bitter pill of rationing. Clearly saw any hint that sugar wasn't vital as a major threat.
And speaking of threats, the book talks about their battle against artificial sweeteners, cyclamates, saccharin.
Yeah, that became a huge fight as diet foods started using those alternatives. The legal framework, like the 1958 Food Additive Amendment, and especially the Delaney Clause.
The one about cancer in animals?
That's the one. banning anything shown to cause cancer in animal tests. That became the battleground.
So the sugar industry funded research against them.
According to the book, yes. Between 1963 and 1969, the Sugar Association apparently spent over $250,000 funding research specifically designed to raise safety questions about cyclaments and saccharin, keeping negative stories about them in the news.
And did it work? Did it affect regulation?
It seems to have contributed. The FDA did end up banning cyclaments in 1970 and took saccharin off the GRAS, generally recognized as safe list, in 1972. Partly based on animal studies,
Yeah.
though often using incredibly high doses.
Like ridiculously high.
Like the equivalent of drinking 800 diet sodas a day for your entire life, and one study cited. And the book even quotes a confidential tobacco industry memo describing a sugar industry guy as a supreme scientific politician who got cyclaments condemned on somewhat shaky evidence.
Wow. Okay, so while that's going on, the idea of a war on sugar was starting to brew in the 60s too, with some researchers linking it to metabolic issues.
Right, some people were starting to connect dots between sugar and things related to diabetes and heart disease.
But another idea really took over instead, the dietary fat hypothesis.
Exactly. The idea that fat, particularly saturated fat, was the main dietary enemy causing heart disease became dominant. Figures like Ansel Keys were hugely influential here.
And Keys' lab had sugar industry funding.
The book notes that, yes. And Keys was known for publicly ridiculing scientists who disagreed with the fat hypothesis, including people like John Yudkin.
Yudkin was the one arguing sugar was the problem for heart disease.
Yes, Yudkin was the main proponent of the sugar hypothesis for heart disease, and he was largely dismissed or attacked by the mainstream focused on fat.
And the book points out a big difference in research funding, right?
A crucial difference. There were massive, very expensive, long-term clinical trials funded to test the dietary fat hypothesis.
Did they prove it?
Well, Taubes argues strongly that those trials consistently failed to show that eating less fat actually made people live longer. But the key point is, no similar large-scale effort was ever funded to properly test Yudkin's sugar hypothesis.
So the fat idea got tested, failed according to Taubes, but the sugar idea never really got its day in court, so to speak.
That's the argument. And this bias, this focus on fat and dismissal of sugar, apparently showed up in official reports too.
Like the National Commission on Diabetes report in '76.
Yeah. It concluded the big dietary issue for diabetes was just total calories, didn't matter where they came from, found no known biological basis to link sugar or carbs specifically to the disease. And the book points out key experts on that commission had sugar industry connections.
And that FDA safety review of sugar around the same time, the SCOGS report.
Similar story, according to the source. It relied heavily on studies funded by the sugar industry and authors funded by the industry. It found conflicting results on heart disease and used industry-backed sources to basically dismiss evidence linking sugar to diabetes.
So the industry's funding priorities were pretty clear.
It seems so. Between 75 and 80, the book says their focus was on research that would maintain research as a main prop of the industry's defense. They were largely funding studies and researchers likely to exonerate sugar.
It really does paint a picture of how money and influence can potentially steer the whole scientific conversation and even public health policy.
It certainly raises those questions, yeah, about what research gets done, what gets published, and what becomes accepted wisdom.
Okay, let's shift perspective slightly again. The book discusses this concept of diseases of civilization, sometimes called Western diseases.
Right. This is an idea championed by researchers like Peter Cleve, Yudkin again, Dennis Burkitt, Hugh Trowell.
And what's the core idea?
It's based on observing that a whole group of chronic diseases, things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, gout, even certain cancers, IBS, Crohn's, some autoimmune disorders, they tend to cluster together.
Cluster, meaning if you have one, you're more likely to have others.
Exactly, both within individuals and within whole populations. And the really striking thing is that these diseases are generally rare or even non-existent in populations eating traditional non-Westernized diets.
But they become common, even epidemic, when those same populations adopt Western diets and lifestyles.
Precisely. That's the key observation.
So the book uses Occam's razor here.
Yeah, the principle that the simplest explanation is often the best one. If all these different diseases rise and fall together, linked to this Western pattern of eating and living, it strongly suggests there might be a single underlying cause, or at least one major common factor driving the whole cluster.
Rather than each disease having its own separate unrelated cause.
Right, it's more likely one thing is triggering multiple downstream effects.
And the Tokelau Islands example is used to illustrate this.
It's a really compelling case study in the book. This population migrated from their traditional islands to New Zealand. And as their diet and lifestyle rapidly westernized, boom.
What happened?
Diabetes prevalence shot up to almost 38%. Over 2/3 of the adults became obese. Gout incidence soared. And crucially, during this exact same transition period, their sugar consumption went through the roof.
Wow. So that links back to the metabolic ideas we were talking about earlier. Insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome.
That's the connection the book makes. The old view was maybe obesity causes diabetes and heart disease because fat people eat too much and don't move enough.
Right.
But the alternative perspective, the one Taubes builds on, flips that. It sees metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance as the underlying problem. They are what drives the obesity, the heart disease risk, the diabetes.
Yeah. Okay, so insulin resistance is the root.
Or at least a central hub. And since so many of these other Western diseases, hypertension, gout, maybe even some cancers, Alzheimer's are strongly associated with obesity and diabetes.
They also link back to that same underlying insulin resistance.
That's the argument. It connects the whole cluster.
Yeah.
And if you then argue that sugars, specifically sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, are a primary driver of that insulin resistance, then it logically follows, Taubes argues, that sugar is also implicated, maybe heavily, in all those other clustered diseases.
Yeah.
That's why he says sugar should be the prime suspect we investigate.
That's a really powerful framework. It definitely makes you look beyond just calories or fat. Okay, let's quickly touch on how this applies to some specific diseases mentioned. Gout, for instance.
Right. Gout involves high uric acid levels. The book cites research showing that diets high in fructose specifically cause high uric acid or hyperuricemia.
Fructose, not just sugar generally.
Fructose seems key here. And insulin resistance also independently raises uric acid levels. So sugar, which is half fructose, and also raises insulin, hits it from both directions, making it potentially the worst carb for gout risk.
Okay, what about high blood pressure, hypertension?
Well, the source points out again that pattern. Populations on traditional diets don't typically see blood pressure rise with age like we do in the West, but it emerges when they westernize.
The standard explanation is usually salt, right?
Oh, that's the common hypothesis, yeah. Salt makes you retain water, increases blood volume, raises pressure. But Taubes argues, look, hypertension is one of the diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome. It clusters with the others. So isn't it more likely caused by the same underlying thing, potentially sugar-driven insulin resistance?
Makes sense within that framework. And cancer. That's a big one.
It is. And again, the historical observation. Reports suggested cancer was much rarer in non-Westernized populations. Leading pioneers in cancer research, like John Higginson, who founded IRRC, concluded that most human cancers are probably caused by environmental factors, mainly diet and lifestyle.
So how does the metabolic perspective link sugar to cancer?
The argument involves insulin again, and a related hormone called IGF. Insulin-like growth factor. Both are typically elevated in insulin resistance.
And they affect cancer cells?
They're thought to promote cancer growth. They basically signal precancerous or cancerous cells to suck up glucose much more aggressively than normal cells. That's called the Warburg effect.
Fueling the cancer.
Fueling proliferation, yeah. And they can also inhibit programmed cell death.
Yeah.
So the theory is, if you're constantly raising your insulin and blood sugar levels because of insulin resistance, you might be creating the perfect environment to initiate or promote cancer growth.
Which means whatever causes the insulin resistance.
It's like sugar, in this argument, becomes a prime suspect as a cancer promoter. Even though, as the book notes, this idea is rarely voiced in mainstream public health discussions about cancer prevention.
That's a sobering connection. And finally, Alzheimer's disease.
There's a known strong link. Alzheimer's risk is higher in people with type 2 diabetes, people who are obese in midlife, people with high insulin levels, people with hypertension.
All components are consequences of metabolic syndrome.
Exactly. So the logic follows again. If sugar causes insulin resistance, and insulin resistance drives diabetes, obesity, hypertension, all of which raise Alzheimer's risk, then sugar, indirectly but powerfully, increases your likelihood of developing dementia. It fits the pattern.
So seeing all these major chronic diseases potentially linked back to insulin resistance, with sugar being pointed to as a key driver, it really makes you question that standard advice, doesn't it? Just eat sugar in moderation.
It does. The book calls that advice a tautology, basically meaningless in practice. Well, think about it. How do you know what moderation is for you? Often, you only find out you've been exceeding your personal threshold when you actually develop symptoms of insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, like you start gaining significant weight, your blood pressure goes up, your blood sugar creeps into the pre-diabetic range.
Which, as we said, could take years or even decades to become obvious.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And by the time those signs appear, the underlying metabolic dysfunction might have been progressing for a very long time, maybe since childhood. So amounts that seem moderate now might be way too much to actually reverse the situation.
Especially if the first sign is something really serious, like the book mentions, like cancer.
Right. By then, moderation is kind of irrelevant advice.
And it's fascinating. The book points out how the whole concept of the glycemic index might have actually, maybe inadvertently, made sugar seem less harmful for a while.
Yeah, that's an interesting twist. The glycemic index, or GI, just measures how quickly a food raises your blood sugar. Fructose, which is half of table sugar, and HFCS, gets metabolized mostly in the liver. It doesn't spike blood sugar nearly as much as glucose does. So pure fructose has a very low GI.
And because table sugar and HFCS are roughly half fructose, half glucose, their overall GI isn't actually that high.
Exactly. It's lower than things like white bread or potatoes. And this led some people, even health organizations, to think sugar wasn't a huge concern, especially for diabetics, because it didn't cause a massive immediate blood sugar spike.
So the American Diabetes Association actually adopted that view.
By 1986, yeah, that was their official position. Sugar was okay in moderation for diabetics because of its relatively low GI.
Which seems completely at odds with the argument about insulin resistance and fructose's unique metabolic effects in the liver.
It really highlights how focusing on just one single metric, like immediate blood sugar response, can potentially miss the bigger, longer-term metabolic picture.
Yeah. And the book notes that total consumption of caloric sweeteners actually went up after the 1980s.
Significantly. From around 113 pounds available per person per year in the early 70s, up to 150 pounds by 1999.
150 pounds per person.
Yeah, right alongside those big surges in the obesity and diabetes epidemics we talked about at the start. And that 150 pounds, that was like 2 or 3 times the amount the FDA had officially deemed safe, just 13 years earlier.
Wow. It really puts the scale of consumption into perspective and how maybe the guidelines weren't keeping up.
It's a stark contrast, yeah.
So let's try and wrap this up. We've taken a pretty deep dive here into The Case Against Sugar, Gary Taubes' book. We've looked at sugar's journey through history.
From medicine to mass market staple.
Right. We've explored the scientific debates, that whole calorie versus hormone argument.
And how industry influence might have played a pretty significant role in which side won out, at least for a long time.
Definitely. And the core argument that comes through is that sugar, especially the sucrose and high fructose corn syrup that are everywhere, it might not just be empty calories.
No, the argument is it's potentially a unique metabolic disruptor, a primary driver of insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome.
And that dysfunction, that insulin resistance, is then presented as the common thread linking that whole cluster of chronic Western diseases: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, gout.
Maybe even certain cancers and Alzheimer's, too.
It's a perspective that really challenges that old calorie is a calorie model for these diseases. It suggests that if you're worried about this cluster of health problems, focusing specifically on sugar intake might be absolutely crucial for prevention, maybe even for treatment.
It shifts the focus dramatically.
Which really leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. If insulin resistance truly is this common link connecting so many of these major chronic diseases,
and if the evidence presented here makes a compelling case that sugar is a primary driver of that insulin resistance,
well, how does that change the way you look at the food environment all around us? And what does healthy eating or even moderation truly mean for you in your own life in this modern world awash with sugar?